Okay, well, again, apologize. Linda said she got to see the recording from chapter 5. Just so you know, when I publish those, you can see them immediately. You don't have to have a link or whatever. If you subscribe to the channel or you know where to go, you can go to the Minor Prophets um, group or whatever and see the recording. So sometimes if I don't get my emails out quickly, you can still find them as long as you do a search. They're available to anybody out there in the public as well. So don't hesitate to look for them if you don't get an email from me. I shared earlier, I did come up with some questions for today. I failed to get those emailed out because I didn't even make them until 9 o'clock last night. So running a little bit behind. So it's going to be a pop quiz today. So we'll see how everybody does with that. We're almost done. This week we will cover chapter 6. I think we'll get through it all. There's only 16 verses, but a lot of good information in here as well. Hopefully then we get done with chapter 7 next week. And then as I've shared with people, I think our group, or at least myself, will take a bit of a break over the summer. Have every intentions of picking back up then probably in August, September timeframe. But if we tried to do anything over the summer with me leading, it would be hit or miss. And we would have a lot of breaks. And I'm sure everybody else is pretty busy too with vacations and a lot of things going on in the world. So apologize, but that'll give me a little bit of time, not only to focus on family and work, but also on the bylaws and some other things that have been kind of put on the wayside. So okay, chapter 6. Chapter 6 really is all about more or less the same thing. It is kind of broken up into a couple sections, but for the most part, it's almost like the setting from a courtroom. I mean, it's a lot about charges and responses and rebuttals and verdicts and punishments and different things. So a lot of commentators have made a lot of the same things. I mean, even the beginning verbiage even sounds a lot like a court. It uses a lot of courtroom terms. The very first words in chapter 6 says, "Hear now what the Lord says." Well, that sounds like when a bailiff walks in the room and says, "Everybody rise and hear ye, and the court is now in session." But this entire chapter, Micah is kind of sealing off God's indictment with a covenant lawsuit. So just to give you a quick summary, he begins in verses 1 and 2. He announces the case, and then in verses 3 through 5, he defends God's benevolent actions. He hears the people's response or defense in verses 6 and 7, and then he reports the basis for God's judgment, or kind of like citing the law on why they're being subjected to this case in verse 8. And we're going to go through these verses in more detail, but I'm just giving you a summary. And then in verses 9 through 12, Micah and God brings specific accusations to the people of Israel or in Judah. And then in the final 4 verses, he pronounces God's verdict and punishment. So it is laid out almost, like I said, like a Perry Mason hour type session. So we go back to verse 1 and start there. Micah starts off by pleading God's case, and it says, "Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, O you mountains, the Lord's complaint, and you strong foundations of the earth." He's using the metaphors and things that we see a lot in a lot of the prophets, but the word mountain, and this was something that I picked up in the studies, sometimes the word mountain is idiomatic of the term government or higher court or the people or whatever. So it really does kind of apply here. but it's also, kind of establishing the foundation of the earth and God's majesty as well. But it's unusual that we're pleading our case to the mountains and the hills, but that's the metaphor that's being made here. Then it uses words, and everybody's Bibles are a little bit different. It talks about complaints and contends or contentions. To the word contend is a judicial term, and in this context, it means to execute judgment. It says, mine's verse 2 says, and he will contend with Israel. That could also say, and he will execute judgment on Israel. Then in verses 3, God kind of does some rhetorical questions and that kind of stuff. He starts putting it out there, and it says, "Oh, my people, what have I done to you? And how have I wearied you? Testify against me, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and I redeemed you from the house of bondage, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam." So he's starting off by reminding them of his past righteous acts and trying to remind them about where they came from and what he's done to save them and get them to the point where they are today. And so he's reminding them of the Exodus, and he's even indicating that as far back then, he was sending prophets to guide them. And the interesting thing is, he mentions Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. And this is the first time that actually a woman was listed as a prophetess. And the word prophetess is used for Miriam back in, I believe it's Numbers. But no, some people think that perhaps Sarah was a prophet, but she was never officially called a prophet. It was more of an interpretation or a belief of people. And I think it's interesting too that he's bringing up the 3 brothers and sisters and that kind of stuff. And it's also interesting that the leader of the Israelite people was the baby of the family as well too. Aaron was older than Moses, and Miriam was older than both of them. So just some interesting context there of some details that he brought up to them. So this brings us to my first question. The next part of this section, verse 5, Micah asks the people to remember 2 previous events so that they may know the righteousness of the Lord. But he just says, remember this event, but then you have to go back in time, or you have to go back to those sections of the Bible to look this up and to make that connection. He doesn't make it real clear in here. So absent that discussion, it just kind of becomes some of that meaningless scripture sometimes, unless you know the history or look it up. You don't know that is. But the first one he mentions, it says, "Oh, my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, counseled, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him." And I don't know if anybody remembers this, if you've gone back and read those sections or whatever, but does anybody remember what transpired between Balak and Balaam? And I apologize for not getting these to you in advance.
Well, I don't have the 2 characters straight in my mind, but one's a king and one's a prophet. And that king wanted the prophet to prophesy against Israel somehow, and he refused to do it, I think 2 times, but he finally gave, and he did ask the Lord for guidance, but he finally gave in to the king and rode. I remember the part where he rode a donkey, and finally there was an angel of the Lord trying to divert the action of the prophet conceding to the king. And I think the donkey spoke. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's what.
Yeah, and you've already nailed the key portions of this, and that Balak was the king of Moab, and he was seeing the progress and stuff that the victories and things that the Israelites had been having in their various battles and their marches in the area. So he was trying to slow them down or defeat them himself. And he actually paid Balaam, who was a prophet, to not only prophesy, but to curse the Israelites.
Yes.
And I think it was actually three times he asked them to curse them. And each time Balaam would get up there, and instead of cursing them, he would bless them. And so Balak was like, I asked you to curse them, or I paid you to curse them. And each time you did the exact opposite. And what Balaam's response is, I could have, I tried, but how can I not use the words that the Lord God put in my mouth? So it was, God kind of took over, and Balaam did what was right as opposed to what he was paid to do and things. So that's the first story, or the part of the righteousness or whatever. So yeah, you're a good study, Sherry. So you even went in a little bit extra, but yeah, they when he was trying to then send Balaam somewhere, you're right. It's not really a part of this particular question, but the donkey could see the angel and kept trying to go around the angel or off into the fields, and Balaam would smack the donkey with a stick or something, and finally the donkey turned around, looked at him, and goes, "What did I ever do to you that required you to hit me with a stick? Haven't I always done what you've asked?" and different things. And I think finally God revealed the angel to Balaam, and then he understood. So, and I think the moral there is you don't always know what's going on behind the scenes, and maybe this is an appropriate discussion with what Laura and Mike are going through. Is that some people don't see everything, but yet they make judgment on the parts that they can see, and judgment is not always correct because they don't have all the facts and everything. So I think that's interesting that this came up at about the same time of what Laura mentioned. The second part of this question, the next phrase or sentence, it says, "From Acacia Grove to Gilgal, that you may know the righteousness of the Lord." And this one's a little bit more of a little more difficult to understand and that kind of stuff. Acacia Grove is also a metaphor, another name for Shittim. Shittim is a city or whatever that was actually, I believe, in Moab, just east of the Jordan River. And so does anybody know what he's talking about from Acacia Grove to Gilgal? What time frame that might have been and what occurred then?
Well, my study Bible helps me a little bit here at the bottom, but it appears that the Acacia Grove was where they received some instruction from God before they crossed into the promised land. And then Gilgal was the first campsite once they had crossed the river into the promised land. It said these two places represent God's loving care for his people, his willingness both to protect them and warn them about potential troubles.
Right. Yeah. If you Shittim is in the Bible, many places. There's a lot of events that happened there. But for the most part, everything on that side of the river always seemed to have a negative connotation or whatever, or some acts of violence or evil of some degree. And this crossing from Acacia Grove to Gilgal was when Joshua and everything, like I said, this was the camp before they crossed the Jordan into the promised land. And one of the commentaries that I had found said, this is representative of the fact that when they were in Shittim, this was when they were homeless and they were still being punished for their evils and their sins and things prior to being redeemed and rewarded with their new homeland in Gilgal. So Gilgal was the first camp after they crossed the Jordan River and then began their battles and stuff of taking the land which was given to them. So again, I think this one's, like I said, a little tougher to understand, but this is the Lord, providing them with the guidance and the rewards and the redemption and things as a metaphor for the righteousness and stuff that they have earned. So very good, both of you. Okay, well then in verses 6 and 7, like I said, then after God makes his case and gives them the framework for he can't understand why they're being the way they are and stuff against him. He lets the people, I guess, kind of make their case, and they more or less come back with, God's demands were being unreasonable. I mean, God says, why are you against me after all I've done to you? And then they come back with, well, what do you expect from us and stuff? And then they argue that even to bring offerings and sacrifices and what do you want, God? What do you want? Our firstborn son? Is that going to be enough? They're making a case, or they're just arguing that they can't do enough. They could give him all of their oil, all of their calves, all of their offerings. And we saw this a little bit, and I even went back to kind of compare. Hosea was almost about the same time frame. He was one of the contemporaries, and this reminded me of several verses in Hosea that we saw in Hosea 5:6. If you remember, when Hosea was prophesying to the Israelites and stuff, they thought that their way out of sin or to get on the right side of God was also to redeem themselves with offerings. They said, oh, well, all I got to do is go to the temple and make a sacrifice or burn some animals or whatever, and we'll be okay. And so what this is trying to say is that that's how they think, or that's what they believe is going to get them on the right side of God. And, we can all, kind of take offense of the offering of a firstborn son, but back then there were several pagan rituals to where people would sacrifice their children to the pagan god Moloch. So even though they're making it sound so extreme, there were people in that region and in that area at the time that were literally doing this and stuff. And I think we read a little bit about, or discussed that on some in Ruth when she was in Moab. Some of the Moabs were devout followers of Moloch and did some of those kind of things. So again, the people here, they're not understanding what God's trying to tell them. They're just thinking, well, we can't give you enough to buy ourselves out of sin. You're never going to be happy. And again, that's when, God's saying you're not getting it. So I'm going to talk about verse 8 in a question. Verse 8, I'm not going to read it to you, but verse 8, Micah provides God's counter argument or his rebuttal to the people's defense. They ask him, what do you want, God? What do you expect from us? And then God comes back with 3 very simple requirements. And so I just kind of want to have somebody list those 3 things, but then I want to kind of not only just read them aloud, but then I want to say, okay, but now what does that mean? Or what does that say to you in different things? So anybody want to take that?
it says, he requires of you to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Right. Yeah, and some Bibles say to do justly, but that's the same thing as to do right or whatever. So let's take them one at a time. What does to do justly mean to you? I mean,
Well, to me, justly and right are not exactly the same things. When I was looking at to do what is right, I was thinking follow the 10 commandments that God had given us, because he kind of set out some rules to help us live properly. Now, I don't know if that's the same thing as justly or not.
yeah, I think it is. And let me hit this next slide. Justly is a form of justice. So when you seek justice, you seek what is right, you seek fairness and that kind of stuff. So the simplest way that I can describe this is to do justly can be defined as giving someone what they are owed or what they deserve. So if somebody did a fair deal with somebody and they agreed to sell property for X number of shekels per acre, then they expect to get that. But then if somebody cheated them or took the land from them, you're not being just with them. You're not being fair. So the first part of this phrase again is to treat people right, because this is what they deserve and this is what they're owed. So now to love mercy. Any thoughts on that? What would be a short way to define to love mercy?
My Bible says love kindness.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, and that can be a similar word. A lot of times we associate the word mercy also with grace and kindness and love and things. And so my definition is, this is when you give somebody what they're not owed or what they don't deserve and stuff. Maybe they're not righteous people. I mean, again, maybe this is what Laura's dealing with right now. Maybe right now they don't deserve love and kindness or something, but you give it to them anyway. And you maybe their people are sinning and they don't deserve mercy or grace, but you still provide it to them. You give them a pass. You get pulled over for doing 85 miles an hour and the cop says, hey, just slow down a little bit and give you a warning ticket. Well, he's giving you grace or mercy, right? Did you deserve it? No. You earned the ticket and you didn't get it. So to love mercy is when you're giving somebody something that they don't deserve and you're happy about it. You're joyous. You're not doing it because you have to. There's not a rule book telling you have to give people mercy or grace. But when you give it to them and you feel good about it and things, then you're loving mercy. And then the last one, walk humbly with your God. And this one can be a little trickier. But when you kind of tie it to these items, can anybody come up with a way of what, how it relates to these two items, and what does walking humbly with your God mean?
Well, you would be placing yourself with God above you, and you as considering yourself insignificant.
Right.
I don't know if that's.
Walking humbly, and of course that's a word of, derivative of humility or whatever. But yes, I mean, just about anybody can kind of walk humbly with God, which is basically, I guess, to some degree, just being quietly subservient in different things. And I got a couple quotes here that I'll I'll share, but when we walk humbly with God, it's when we acknowledge that he is just and that only through his mercy are we made whole. Now, I didn't write this one. I found this one on the internet. But when we truly believe this, it flows out of our lives into the lives of others. So when we do the first two, when we treat people right and we give grace and mercy to people because we want to do it and we love to do it, we're following God. We're doing what he has suggested we should be doing, not because we have to, but because we want to. But the part about walking humbly that I think is when you do these kind of things quietly. You don't do them with the intent of making the newspapers or getting credit and that kind of stuff. You know, I did a session on people that give and stuff that you don't even really know who they are. You know, it's when you hear people like the Bill Gates of the worlds and stuff who give millions to something, but they make sure they do it with a press conference.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. It's the people that quietly give and that kind of stuff that don't want that recognition and everything. That maybe they're not quite as humble as they seem. And so I found this in Philippians. It says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility, value others above yourselves. And another quote that I have seen many, many times in business and stuff like that is, integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching and stuff. So I thought, you know, those were two quotes I thought that really described being humble and that kind of stuff. As you know, not bragging on yourself, not trying to get your name in the paper saying, look what I did for these people and that kind of stuff. Just doing it. And some people don't want that recognition because then they know they're going to get 20 more requests right after that. But some people have reasons to be humble other than the fact that, you know, that's really the Christian way. So any thoughts on that before I move on to the...
Yeah, I
Go ahead,
wanted to agree with part of what Keith had already pointed out. It's to allow the Lord to put you in your place sometimes. You know, I've experienced that many times over, where you suddenly realize there's more to the story than you know, or you've done something wrong, that kind of thing.
Right.
Well, I think it's very interesting too, that this little snippet that tells us how to live really is in contrast to what success is defined as in our culture. Because in our culture, we're so focused on self and elevating our accomplishments and self-concept, and you need to have a healthy self this and self that, and that's not what God is after. He is after us looking after other people and being humble. So it's very different from our concept of success today.
Right. Well, and that's what that one study that I did that I talked about too, is that it's okay to make money and things like that. But it's what you do with it after you make it that defines your success and that kind of stuff. You know, if you're a Warren Buffett and your goal is to just keep piling those dollars up higher and higher and higher, that's one thing. But I think his name is David Green, who owns Hobby Lobby. Nobody really knows who he is, but he donates almost $500 million a year almost to missions and Christian museums and things like that. I mean, it's what he does with the money afterwards that defines or sets him apart from others. So yeah, the success is, you know, what you do with that afterwards and everything. And if you do righteous things and you use it to show grace to people, then you can be a billionaire and still meet those three words or those three phrases in guidance. So I think it's not totally in conflict, but for some people it's a major conflict. And I think I even bring that up a little bit later on here in a minute. Going on now to the specific accusations, Micah actually does then start going into a little more details, and some of these are very similar to what we've heard in some of the other prophets. But Micah starts off by telling the city, and the assumption is he's telling Jerusalem, the Lord's voice cries to the city, wisdom shall see your name, hear the rod who has appointed it. And some of the commentaries that I've read stuff is talking about, hear the rod. Some Bibles say heed the rod, but they're making the connection that hearing the rod sometimes is hearing God, and a rod is often the symbol of judgment or punishment. We've seen or read several times that people will take a rod and strike people in the cheek. Rods are often used to guide animals and stuff. An ox goad is used to steer the ox and different things. But in this context here, hearing the rod is really a form of hearing God and that kind of stuff. And found another C.S. Lewis quote that said that, and this makes a lot of sense. It says, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. And it is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And so, that kind of makes a lot of sense. We've talked about when times are good, and when life is bringing us milk and honey and everything's joyous, we sometimes tend to forget who's making that happen for us. And so we don't always hear or talk to God, or very often. So I think that kind of applies here, that God whispers to us in our pleasures. We barely hear him, or we're not paying attention. Maybe when we're in conflict in our lives, or we're just thinking about something that's bothering us, well, then we tend to start carrying on that conversation and having a two-way conversation about what's going on with us. But when we're really messing up and that kind of stuff, and when God really wants to be heard, he deals it to us in pain and strife and everything, and he can get our attention pretty quick when we need it and stuff. So I thought this was a very appropriate quote to help explain this verse about hearing the rod. Then he goes on to talk about the leaders of Jerusalem. It says, are there yet the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the short measure that is an abomination? If you remember, short measures is where they were usually cheating people with scales and weighing food and fruit and things like that. It says, shall I count pure those with the wicked scales and with the bag of deceitful weights? For her rich men are full of violence, her inhabitants have spoken lies, and their tongue is deceitful in their mouth. And this is also some very similar language that Amos used. Remember, Amos was one of the prophets from the country, so to speak, kind of like Micah, not really raised in the city, but was really good at pointing out the iniquities amongst the leaders and the business people within the cities. So he's saying here, the leaders of Jerusalem have practiced violence and social injustice. They've cheated people in their trade, and the rich in power abused the weak through violence and practiced treachery through lies and deceit. If you remember, they would take people to court and lie and pay the judges behind the scenes and get a ruling in their favor. So they were just taking advantage of their place in life. And man, we certainly see a lot of all of these things going on in our world today. It's the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and people abuse the court systems and everything else to wipe out the little guy. Then we start getting into some of the final verses here, and says, God's verdict of judgment for sins is certain. But the Lord is going to frustrate their best efforts. He's going to, I think there were some interesting phrases here. He's putting, we saw some stuff similar to this with Hosea and Gomer. If you remember, he was putting things in Gomer's way, trying to slow her down, or trying to, of course, the Israelite people was a metaphor for, or Gomer was a metaphor for the Israelites, but trying to use a little nudge and power steering to get them back on course. So God's trying to, he's saying here that he's going to try to frustrate them, or try to show them the correct way. It says, therefore, I will also make you sick by striking you, by making you desolate because of your sins. You shall eat, but not be satisfied. Hunger shall be in your midst. You may carry some away, but shall not save them. And what you do rescue, I will give over to the sword. You shall sow, but not reap. You shall tread the olives, but not anoint yourselves with oil, and make sweet wine, but not drink wine. So he's basically saying, I don't care how hard you work, you're not going to be productive. If you're not doing the righteous thing, now today it seems like he's not frustrating very many people, because there's still some people that are doing well but not doing anything with it and that kind of stuff. And I think it comes down to when will that happen. But the phrase, they will eat yet still be hungry, that phrase is almost identical to what Hosea said in chapter 4, verse 10 about, it basically means you're not going to be satisfied. It's like you're taking a drink of water, but you're still thirsty. And this reminds me of the question that we often pose to the very rich is, when will you have enough and stuff? You could already be a billionaire, or some people are pushing close to trillions now, but they're still striving for more and that kind of stuff. At what point do you slow down and start doing something? I guess to some degree, Bill Gates is doing that with his money and different things, but I'm not sure he's doing it because he wants to be righteous. I think as much as he's trying to right some wrongs, but maybe not in the name of God, I think is one of the concerns. But basically in these verses here, he's promising a tragic end for all their ill-gotten gains, because it says, even if you are able to carry away some, but you shall not save them, and what you do rescue, I will give over to the sword. So he's basically saying, God is going to destroy some of and there are some that did get their ill-gotten gains, and it was all taken away. I mean, you look at the Bernie Madoffs of the world and people like that. You like to think that God had a say in their outcome of what they were doing, and he would allow them no blessings for their possessions. Then in verse 16, Micah then goes on to point out, he brings up some policies of Omri and Ahab. And it took me a second to read that. I first read that as for the statues of Omri are kept. It's not statues, it's statutes, which is basically a law, or in this case, a policy. And it says, for the statutes of Omri are kept, all the work of Ahab's house are done. He's basically pointing out that these people are still doing or following the ways of some of their former kings. And Omri and Ahab were a father-son kings. I think they were the 6th and 7th kings of Israel. And they're both listed among the evil kings, or the not so good, or the kings that did bad. Omri was kind of famous for establishing stability. He did kind of create some peace. He had some military might, he did win some battles, but probably one of the biggest things that he did, he negotiated or made peace with the Canaanites. And part of that was he kind of allowed or even propagated to some level their types of cults and idolatry and different things. So he was one of the earliest people to introduce idolatry and pagan worship of various kinds in Israel. Ahab, who was his son, continued that. But Ahab got into several bouts with Elijah and Elisha and several of the other prophets. And he had even killed several of the prophets. And if we haven't really studied Kings or Chronicles yet, but he had even stolen people's property. He tried to buy Naboth's vineyards and things, but Naboth said, how can I sell or give away what the Lord God has given to my father? And so he wouldn't deal with him. So Ahab found a way to steal the property anyway by killing him and different thing. And Ahab also had a wife, Jezebel, who eventually got eaten by dogs and stuff. But she also promoted the worship of Baal and paganism and things. So God's just trying to point out that you Israelites think that what's good for the king is good for us. That's not the righteous way to go. So he's just pointing that out. And then but basically failing to walk in the ways of the Lord, the people are going to be an object of contempt and face scorn and reproach. It says, and you walk in their counsels, meaning the kings, that I may make you a desolation and your inhabitants a hissing. A hissing was when people would walk through the streets and the people that didn't like them or wanted to scorn them or whatever would hiss at them and stuff, like a cat or a snake would hiss at people. And it says, therefore you shall hear the reproach of my people. So we're a little bit ahead. I do have one final question here. And like I pointed out, chapter 6, Micah is listing several injustices perpetrated by the people that they must be punished for. And so I just kind of wanted to open this up to see, what kind of injustices occur in our world today. And don't think of it entirely in the U.S. I mean, some of these, happen in the U.S., but there are some other injustices around the world that are so much worse than anything that we perpetrate. But there are some here that are perpetrated all over the world that I've come up with. So just in a few minutes here, come up with a few words to describe injustices going on today. Okay, well, I'll start. Any kind of abuse, whether it be child abuse, sexual abuse, spousal abuse, and the child abuse could be something as simple as labor camps and stuff. Around the world, kids are forced to work for pennies a day if they get paid at all. That's just one example of injustices around the world. Any others?
Russia.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole nother kind of abuse, right? But it is a power grab. It is for all intents and purposes, all about greed. Anybody that believes he's doing it because that used to be a former Russian country, it's not about that. It's about oil and gas and everything. But it's using their governance and power to do things that are not good.
I think we can flip what you
Any
said. We can flip what you said around, and I see an injustice a lot where people who do not need aid take it, and therefore there's not
Right.
enough money for the people who do need it.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into one of mine. One of the ones I had was poverty and starvation. There's more than enough natural resources and food and stuff in this world to take care of people, but we abuse it. We don't always give it to the people that need it. We don't preserve it or whatever. We throw away more food than some countries have altogether. And there's just so many poor people and that kind of stuff because, back to the walking humbly, I meant to say something about this too. How many times have you seen people going to benefits and that kind of stuff in California or New York and that kind of stuff, where they're going there to raise money? They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in catering and entertainment and alcohol, and everybody's wearing $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 dresses and wearing jewelry and all this kind of stuff. And they're trying to raise money, and they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars so they can raise $50,000 to give to somebody and say, look what I've done. And they post pictures on the internet and brag about what they've given. And that's the part that's not humble and stuff. It's one thing to give, but giving humbly is what I wanted to share. And there's so many places to give nowadays and things that seems like some of our charitable events that we hear about have nothing to do with solving the world's injustices. Couple other ones I thought of was just plain racism and slavery. While the U.S. is still deeply entrenched in a lot of racial issues and stuff of all kinds, but there are still parts of the world where slavery is still well known and accepted in things. And people won't deal with it because maybe it's a bigger nation or whatever, or they don't want to offend anybody. But a big one that I thought of that's going on right. I mean, it's going on globally, but it's reared its ugly head here, is gender inequality. And women around the world have always seemed like they've taken second seats and that kind of stuff to the men, especially in Muslim countries and in some Orientals and Far East and stuff. But even here in the U.S., where we have made great strides to try to level the playing field when it comes to different events, women are under attack again today, and we're allowing men to go in and take over women's sports under the guise of transsexualism and that kind of stuff. And people are promoting it and supporting it. And, several women around the world are not happy with it. And the most famous transsexual in the U.S., Bruce Jenner, or Caitlyn Jenner now as he's called, has spoken out that this is not right. This is not fair to women and women's sports and stuff. But if a government tries to regulate it, the government is chastised for violating LGBTQ rights and things like that. So, I think that that's something that's going on right now that is a huge injustice. It's trying to remedy what they think is a perceived injustice by perpetrating an injustice on others. So that one troubles me quite a bit. So anyway, any others before I move on to the last slide? Well, hearing none, to prepare for next week, just read chapter 7. In this chapter, God's pretty much going to give them the resources to react to the trials with hope and talk about redemption and different things. So let me stop